Adobe reporting fourth quarter earnings today after the end of the trading day. Let's take a look at the numbers as they come into the newsroom. So for the fourth quarter, adjusted earnings per share for Adobe coming in at $5.50 versus $4.81. So that's where it was last year. So a beat there. The estimate had been for $5.39. Revenue coming in at $6.2 billion, essentially. It's a 10% increase from last year. And the estimate had been for $6.11 billion, so a bit of a beat for revenue for Adobe. They also put forward a first quarter forecast, adjusted earnings per share, $5.85 to $5.90. The estimate from Bloomberg had been $5.66. So that looks good for a forecast for Adobe. 2026 year forecast revenue at $25.9 billion to $26.1. The estimate had been 25.9, so right in the lower end of that range. All right, let's break down the numbers with Matthew Swanson, software analyst from RBC Capital Markets. Thanks for joining us today. What is your first read of the numbers?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I was really excited when I saw the numbers because the biggest thing we've been working on with Adobe throughout this year is really cutting down noise so we can get back to looking at the long-term thematics and really building up some of the sentiment that has been troublesome for them around the Gen AI monetization. So as you mentioned, still showing strong profitability, which has been a hallmark of Adobe for a long time. We're seeing the revenue growth come in above consensus, both for the quarter and in the guidance, and then another double-digit ARR guide for next year.
How do you cut down on the noise when there are clear questions about rolling out of software in a time of AI?
Yeah, no, I think it's a really good question. I think it's a really important question when we talk about Adobe. You know, one of the things we keep talking about is we feel like there's been a better story than storytelling during 2025 for Adobe. And a lot of that has to do with the crossroads you just mentioned, which is competition and Gen AI. And I think when we look at Q3 results and then we look at what they gave us at Adobe Max and then pair that with Q4 results, what we're really seeing is the company's ability to turn those challenges into positives, right? We've seen 24 different integrated models now into their platform. We've seen the news even this morning about Adobe getting integrated into ChatGPT. And we've also seen a lot of new partnerships with some of these big publishers who have creative tools, right? We've seen it with YouTube and TikTok and Facebook. And I think that's kind of the core idea of how they cut down on a lot of this competitive noise is both Adobe and these companies saying, hey, we're not competitors. We're all working towards the same thing.
Okay, tell me how the ChatGPT agreement could work for them. Essentially, they're allowing some of their software, people who are used to using their software, to now access it through ChatGPT.
Yeah, absolutely. And this goes back to the idea of Adobe's kind of right to win as a very common buzzword we're hearing across Gen AI, the orchestration layer, right? The orchestration layer of digital assets. If you want to do that, the idea is you end up kind of playing the Switzerland role where you have to be integrated into the ChatGPTs, into the Metas, into the YouTubes, into everywhere where people are creating and making this work, whether it be advertising, marketing materials, or if you look at Adobe Acrobat, just kind of the normal course of business materials that you need to build. The area that we're going to continue to get a moderate amount of pushback early on here is if you read the press release, we're not quite sure yet exactly how the pricing and the monetization works. So we know that they're going to be getting the users of ChatGPT. We know that's really good real estate for Adobe to get that partnership, that when people want to create within ChatGPT, they're going to be able to use Photoshop. It's great for top of funnel. But in terms of some of the more of the bear thesis that keeps kind of saying, when does ARR reaccelerate? Where's the monetization? We're still a bit more in a wait and see period for that.
Do you think perhaps it's a trial of how it works with ChatGPT and then an announcement to come of revenue from that?
Yeah, I would assume that at some point there has to be a revenue share. We've seen Adobe actually be remarkably resilient when you talk about how much cost they have to take on for doing all this image and video generation, where we haven't seen a great amount of revenue offset up to this point. So I do think right now we are in a bit of the land grab stage. But I think when we're talking about generating images and looking at a lot of these competitors too in the point solutions, the value of the image, what you can charge someone to make it, a lot of that's going to come back to how much is that final product actually worth. And so that's going to come down to, Adobe's marketing suite, their advertising suite, being able to prove to people, hey, not only can we make 10, 20, 100x as much content as before, there's actually a monetizable and ROI reason why we should do it. And so I think that's kind of where we're going to almost work backwards from what we can create from all these tools into how we're going to charge, how we're going to monetize them.
Okay, we talked about Adobe partnering with some of these chatbots, ChatGPT being the first one there. But how is it using AI in its own business to better drive either sales or profit?
Yeah, I think that the biggest thing that makes Adobe differentiated, right, because there are a lot of different companies that are doing the generative content, is I think some of it's the generative editing, right, which is more about pulling into this suite that they've built over 40 years instead of kind of sticking to this fight that's become very, very competitive in the last 2 years. But it's also the idea that it can go from content creation, making that first image, all the way to the marketing platform on the other side where it actually gets served and have that one consistent automated workflow. And so it's very similar in some ways to the revolution we saw when AI came for DevOps, right? And we're able to have this CI/CD, this continuous life cycle. And I think that's the pitch that Adobe's going into these large enterprises with. It's basically saying that, yeah, a lot of different people can make that first image, but unless you have everything integrated end to end, you're going to find a choke point. And that's where it really is about embedding AI in every step of the Adobe platform and kind of building a differentiated value proposition than all these solutions that are focusing solely on the content creation.
Who would be its biggest competitors, Matthew, at this point?
Yeah, so I mean, there's kind of three groups that we talk a lot about. The point solutions, which we've spent a little bit of time. I think we've seen the integrations from there. We see a lot of the large publishers getting easier to do some of their own standalone creative tools. In terms of Amazon, you can build ads for Amazon. Meta, you can build ads for Meta. I think we'd look at Adobe as more of a Switzerland, right? A central repository where you build once, deploy anywhere. But from the SMB market, if you only work with one of them, those could become really interesting tool bases. And then in terms of a pure play company, Canva is the one that obviously comes up the most. I think they're still a little bit further down market, but obviously working really hard to move up into the enterprise.
All right. Matthew Swanson, got to leave it there, sir, but thank you for your time. Appreciate it.